Let's talk about wide receivers that you should start and more importantly, sit heading into week 4 of the fantasy season. We'll cover all 32 teams, 16 matchups in total. This is your complete guide to wide receivers in week 4. Let's start with Thursday Night Football. Cowboys at Giants, an NFC East showdown. Two teams who are 1-2. Very impressive win for the Giants in week number 3. It's a 43.5 point over under. The Cowboys are heavily favored. Even though it's at New York, the Giants are 4.5 dogs in this game. CeeDee Lamb thus far has not been the player that you wanted him to be when you drafted him at the 101 or the 102. However, we know just how good CeeDee Lamb is. Of course, you're going to throw him back out there. Friendly reminder, guys, this time last week on this show, I told you to start Amari Cooper. I said, look, it's a get-back game versus a weak Giants secondary. Amari Cooper popped off. I think we could see the same thing here for CeeDee Lamb. As far as the other wide receivers in Dallas, I don't personally think there's a name that you can start, but Jalen Tolbert has back-to-back good weeks, so definitely a name that you should stash off the waiver wire if you haven't done so yet. On the opposite side of the ball, how about that Malik Neighbors, Leak the Freak? He is currently the #1 wide receiver in fantasy football, back-to-back weeks, over 28 fantasy points. He did it versus Washington, and then we were like, okay, Cleveland's a different story, but he did it against Cleveland again. Now he faces the Cowboys. I don't see, again, the outcome, who knows what the outcome could be, but I don't see how you sit Malik Neighbors. I just don't see how it's possible to sit a guy who's averaging almost 15 targets per game in the last 2 weeks. You've got to put this guy in your lineups. And low-key, Wan'Dale Robinson's been sneaky. 8 targets last week, over 13 fantasy points, but I'm not personally trusting him in my lineup. All right, the second matchup we will look at here is the Saints at the Falcons. This is the start of the 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time Sunday slate of games. Let's start with the Saints side of the ball. Chris Olave, one of my bounce back candidates last week. He comes out, puts up over 20 points on the Eagles' head top. Now he faces the Falcons. I definitely still think he's in play. It's not as good of a matchup as the Eagles were last week, but he's clearly reminding people that he is the alpha in New Orleans. As far as Rashid Shaheed, I know it was becoming a weekly meme where I was memeing myself telling you guys I don't trust Rashid Shaheed. This week, unfortunately, he came back down to earth. And just a friendly reminder, guys, if you're putting Shaheed out there, you got to know he is the definition of boom or bust. We've talked about this often on this channel, but in 2023, 5 games over 15 points, 10 games under 8 points. And then last week, Shaheed comes out and drops a goose egg, drops a donut. And we're not even talking like a Krispy Kreme. We're talking an old stale donut that nobody wants. It was not fun to watch. And Derek Carr came back down to earth. So look, if you put Shaheed out there, you have to know this is a range of outcome that is possible. As far as the Falcons side of the ball goes, Drake London continues to get more and more involved after week 1. From weeks 2 onwards, he's averaging about 8 targets per game, which is great to see. And he's also averaging over 17 PPR points per game and a touchdown in each of those games as well. So he's got to be in your lineups. And Darnell Mooney is sneaky, guys. He's a sneaky spot start. He continues to produce. He's been averaging 7.5 targets per game in the last 2 weeks, 2 games over 14 PPR points. I mean, this is a guy that's consistently getting work, connected to a quarterback like Kirk Cousins, who has produced multiple wide receiver 2s in fantasy football. We've seen him do it with Jordan Addison. We've seen him do it with Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson. We've seen him do it in Washington, even with all the weapons they had. So absolutely, Darnell Mooney looks like he's a flexible option moving forward and what should be a fun divisional matchup. All right. The next game we'll talk about here is the Bengals at the Panthers, 44.5 point over under. Bengals are heavily favored. At the time of recording this, they are heavily favored, okay? Will that change? Because the Bengals are one of few teams who are 0-3, all right? I think only 6 teams in NFL history have made the playoffs after being 0-3. Is that Cincy? I don't know. We'll find out. Here's what I know for sure. Last week, one of our favorite starts of the week was the Burrow-Chase combination. They both went off. Jamar Chase had multiple touchdowns. It was great to see him do his thing. We got to start Jamar Chase. We know that. And what should be a decent matchup versus the Panthers, especially if the Panthers offense can continue to do what it did last week, this will be a competitive game, which is what we want for fantasy football. As far as T. Higgins goes, man, I'm sorry, guys. Not even going to cap. I told a lot of you guys to start T. Higgins last week. And if Joe Burrow Joe Burrow's one of the most accurate quarterbacks in the NFL. How did he overthrow T. Higgins naked in the back of the end zone? I'm sorry, guys. That should have paid off. I'll take my L though, but I'm willing to start him again this week in a decent matchup. Now, let's talk about the Carolina Panthers, okay? Because Andy, the Red Rifle Dalton, has absolutely revitalized this entire offense. Deontay Johnson is 100% a must start for me. He's coming off a 14 target game, 122 receiving yards, which by the way is a career high for Deontay Johnson, and a touchdown, which was one of the most beautiful passes we have seen this year. And it was from Andy freaking Dalton. And by the way, the guy who was competing for targets with him the most, Adam Thielen, is out with an injury. Deontay could have 20 targets. I know it's hyperbole, but would that surprise anyone at this point if that would happen? Deontay Johnson is absolutely, he has got to be in your lineups. And let's hope for both of these wide receiver cores that this game is going to be competitive all the way through. All right, the fourth matchup we will look at is the Rams at the Bears. 1-2 teams. Guys looking to get up to 500 with their record. 40.5 point over under. The Bears are favored at home. I'll be honest, guys, the Rams wide receiver core is too messy. I don't really want to get involved. Tutu Atwell had 5 targets. Okay, Demarcus Robinson had some targets. He only had 1 catch. Jordan Whittington, his role is growing. Tyler Johnson's involved. There's no one that I can really confidently tell you to start. So personally, I'm probably going to advise you guys to go ahead and sit all of these names. Now, on the opposite side of the ball, it's a tricky situation to navigate the Bears wide receivers. DJ Moore is a must start. We know that, okay? Averaging just under 10 targets per game this year. Rome Odunze has a breakout game last week versus the Colts with no Keenan Allen. So what will his role be if Keenan Allen is back out there this week? He's been dealing with a heel injury. Assuming that Keenan Allen doesn't play, Rome Odunze probably becomes a must start for me in a great matchup versus the Rams. The Rams are giving up the 3rd most points to fantasy wide receivers. But if Keenan Allen does play, I would move Rome Odunze to a spot start status by wide receiver 32 in that scenario. So hopefully that is helpful for you guys moving forward. All right, the 5th matchup we will look at here is the Vikings at the Packers. 43.5 point over under. The Packers are favored. The Vikings are very simple. You start Justin Jefferson, you know that. But how about Jordan Addison? It's looking like, according to the coach, he will play. And Jordan Addison, he could be very relevant in what should be a good matchup versus the Packers. Now, we are assuming with our rankings for the Packers that Jordan Love is going to play. So let's be clear. If Jordan Love does not play, you do not start a single Green Bay Packer wide receiver. You just don't do it. But if Jordan Love does play, Jaden Reed is absolutely someone that you should start. The last time Jordan Love played, Jaden Reed had over 33 fantasy points. Christian Watson is also in play, and I don't really prefer, I don't want to play Dobbs or Wicks, but I guess you could in like a DFS format. But again, if Jordan Love plays, great. Let's put some Packer wide receivers out there. If not, they cannot even sniff your lineup. All right, the 6th matchup we will look at is the Jags at the Texans. The Jags look like maybe the worst team in the NFL. I mean, they might have the 101 this year. They are terrible, absolute cheeks. And I'm not talking about the cheeks that we all like. Jags at Texans, 45.5 point over under. The Jags are giving up the 8th most points to fantasy wide receivers. This should be a smash matchup for Texans wide receivers. Unfortunately, through 3 weeks, Tank Dell does look like the odd man out, right? 4 targets in week 2, 6 targets in week 3. Stephon Diggs had 12 targets last week. They were utilizing him all over the field. Nico Collins is the one who's consistently getting around 10 targets. So look, Collins and Diggs are must starts for me given the matchup. I totally think you can throw Dell out there. I mean, he is dealing with an injury, but he's just the definition of boom bust right now, and it's been mostly bust through 3 weeks. As far as the Jags wide receivers go, I really don't think it's helpful for me to tell you that Kirk got 10 targets last week, that Brian Thomas got 9 targets last week. If anybody watched that game, you would have seen how many times Mac Jones targeted these guys in garbage time. So look, I guess it's like glass half full. They both had more targets, but this is still one of the worst offenses in the NFL. And I'm still playing Brian Thomas over Christian Kirk simply because he has that touchdown equity, that touchdown upside that I don't think Kirk has. Happy to be wrong, but at least you could play the world out where if they're down, they need to throw the ball. You could also have said the same thing last week versus the Bills. How did that work out? It didn't. We all know. All right, the 7th matchup we are looking at today is probably the most boring matchup of the week, at least in my opinion. No disrespect to anybody who's fans of these teams. 38.5 point over under for the Steelers at the Colts. The Steelers are favored. Justin Fields is 3-0 as a Pittsburgh Steeler, 2nd lowest over under of the week. I think it should be the first lowest, as in like the least amount of projected points, but whatever. I'm not controlling the sports books. Let's talk about the Colts, okay? How the hell do you start any Indianapolis Colts wide receiver? Please, someone convince me in the comment section why I should tell any of you to start a Colts wide receiver. It is so messy. This is the most disgusting wide receiver situation in fantasy football this year. Sure, one of them might pop off. They could all suck, just like we saw last week, though. So I have all of them labeled as must-sits. And by the way, we're talking about Josh Downs, who just got into this game plan and had 5 targets, even though he only played 57% of the snaps. What happens if Josh Downs and his role grows? What happens if Adonai Mitchell deserves more snaps? It's just far too messy for me to project any startable asset here. And I don't want this to be a weekly occurrence, but we have to talk about how bad Anthony Richardson has been. Guys, Anthony Richardson is completing under 50% of his passes. That is so bad. That's like historically bad. How are you supposed to rely on that? So, not a good matchup. Quarterback's not playing well. Crowded wide receiver room. Low volume. I mean, how do I tell you to start any of those names? I don't tell you to start any of those names. Now, as far as the Steelers go, look, in deeper formats, you can put George Pickens out there, but the unfortunate reality of this offense and the way that it functions with Arthur Smith is just, it's a low volume passing offense. All right. Justin Fields is not throwing the ball very much. They are running the ball with Najee Harris. They're letting Justin Fields run the ball often. And Justin Fields looks good, but there's just not enough volume to go around for all these names. So you can throw Pickens out there. He's an absolute insane, talented wide receiver, but he's stuck in a situation that is not very favorable. What I will say is this is one of the best matchups in fantasy football. The Colts are giving up so many points to fantasy wide receivers. They're a top 5 matchup. So if you're going to play him any day, this is probably the week to start him. But, he only needs one play to pay off. So that's something we have to consider. All right, the 8th matchup we will look at is the Broncos at the Jets. 38.5 point over under. The Jets are heavily favored. New York Jets are 7.5 point favorites in this game, despite Bo Nix's impressive performance last week versus the Bucs. Honestly, I get it, Vegas. I get why they're such heavy favorites. Look, Bo Nix looked pretty good last week. All right, we have to give him credit. I'm still not starting a Broncos wide receiver. If you want to start one, it's probably Courtland Sutton, who had 11 targets last week, turned that into 13 points. I'm not willing to start Courtland Sutton. It's a lot of like dink and dump. It's almost like they're trying to recreate what Oregon did with Bo Nix last year, that kind of short intermediate game. I just don't think they're valuable targets. I'm not willing to chase it. Now, with the Jets side of the ball, you'll notice I have Garrett Wilson ranked quite low this week. He's my wide receiver 19. He's still in the must-start category, but I have drastically lowered my expectations, and this is for a couple of reasons. Number one, he and Aaron Rodgers haven't really been like fully on the same page just yet. Thank God he got a touchdown last week because his week could have looked pretty bad. But the second reason, and the most important reason, is Garrett Wilson's going to be facing Pat Surtain. He might be the best cornerback in the NFL. He is paid the highest of any quarterback in the NFL, and he's playing like he earned it. Because he did. Now, here's the concern. Pat Surtain this year has already shut down DK Metcalf, has already shut down Mike Evans. Both of those wide receivers had their worst games this year versus Pat Surtain, and I don't see why Pat Surtain doesn't just follow Garrett Wilson all over the field. The Jets' offense is relatively easy to stop. If you stop Breece Hall, if you stop Garrett Wilson, you have a chance to win the game. So look, Garrett Wilson, his talent typically wins out. You can start him, but I'm just lowering expectations. As far as Lazard, though, I mean, guys, 3 targets last week. I know he scored a touchdown. I'm not chasing that. I think Mike Williams could be more and more involved, so it's just not a situation I really want to get involved with. All right, the 9th game we'll look at. This is a rematch of the playoffs from last year. We've got the Bucs and the Eagles. This is at Tampa Bay. 2 teams who are 2-1. The Eagles barely beat the Saints last week. That was a difficult game to watch. 46.5 point over under. Philly is favored away from home, which is interesting. This is tied for the 3rd highest over under of the week. So that is good news for all the wide receivers in this matchup. There's a very realistic chance that A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith won't be available to play in week 4. A.J. Brown, we know the injury that he's currently dealing with. He's working through. He's been out multiple weeks. But Devonta Smith took a nasty hit last week, and he is in concussion protocol at the time of recording this video. I would not be surprised if both of those guys are out. That's going to limit Jalen Hurts' upside, and that's going to ask the question, well, Who do we start, Zach? I mean, probably nobody. I'm not willing to go out there and start Jahan Dotson as a desperation play. You certainly can. You can make the narrative for it that they're going to need him. But I've watched Jahan Dotson enough in Washington to know when you need him, typically he doesn't come through. No disrespect, but I just don't trust him. Maybe you will if you're in a desperate spot. As far as the Bucs go, this is some of my favorite plays this week, to be honest with you guys, point blank period. Chris Godwin, my wide receiver 8. He is a top 3 wide receiver in fantasy football so far this year. Mike Evans, a wide receiver 9 for me in my rankings. I think this is a huge bounce back week for Mike Evans. The Philadelphia Eagles are a get right game for your wide receivers, okay? And Mike Evans, there is nobody, respectfully, Eagle fans, I think you could agree at this point, there's nobody on the opposite side that can really lock down Mike Evans. I think he gets back into the end zone this week. Okay, the 10th game we will look at. This is the start of the afternoon slate of games. We've got Commanders at Cardinals. All right, 49.5 point over under. This is the highest over under of the week. How about Jaden Daniels? Oh, is he going to throw it? Is he going to run it? Oh, I juked your ass. Oh, first down. Guys, the Commanders have not punted the ball in the last 2 weeks. Point blank, period. They have never punted the ball in the last 2 weeks. I mean, this offense is firing on all cylinders, all right? Cliff Kingsbury is making the Bengals look like clowns, respectfully, okay? Now, look, here's the thing. Terry McLaurin does have a good game last week. I can't in good conscience label him a must start. He's a spot start. He remains a spot start, just like he was last week, all right? This could very easily not go Terry's way. We need to see more consistency, but the good news is Jaden Daniels looked very good on Monday Night Football. So, in deeper formats, you can totally play him, but I think 70% of people might have a better option in smaller formats. Now, let's talk about the Cardinals because the Commanders are giving up the most points to fantasy wide receivers. We just saw what Jamar Chase did versus them. We've seen what the Bucs wide receivers did to them in week 1. Marvin Harrison Jr., a must start. My wide receiver 5 this week. Back-to-back weeks where Marvin Harrison Jr. has found the end zone. He looks like an absolute stud. He looks like the guy that you drafted him to be. All right, the 11th matchup we'll look at is the Patriots at the 49ers. 2 1-2 teams, you know, just 2 teams who are 1-2, just like we expected, facing off. Could you imagine if the Patriots win this game? I keep thinking about it. It would be, oh my gosh, the media would not stop talking about it. But look, 40.5 point over under. The 49ers are favored. They are by far the largest favorites of week number 4. The 49ers implied team point total is over 30 points. The Patriots implied team point total is under 10 points. There's literally no reason to talk about any Patriot wide receivers in your lineup until Drake May takes over. It was great to see Demario Douglas do his thing, but no, we're not starting those names. On the opposite side of the ball, I know Ayuk has been bad. He hasn't scored over 10 points per game, but you can totally put him into your lineup. Look, the game is going to come. We know Ayuk is a good player. You got to put him out there for that breakout game that could be on the way. And Juwan Jennings, I would label a spot start. I'm not going to sit here and say he's a must start. People are going to probably clown me for saying that. I know he had 12 targets last week. I know he had 3 touchdowns, but we're talking about a guy who is averaging under 5 points per game in his entire career. So is this the start of him being the wide receiver 1 on the 49ers? I don't personally think so. I believe it was a product of the Rams focusing so much on Ayuk that Purdy had to go to Juwan Jennings. So look, I could be wrong, but look, I'm labeling him a spot start. He's my wide receiver 28. That means in the majority of leagues, I am starting Juwan Jennings. I'm just saying, like, I'm not going to get cute with it and start Juwan Jennings. You know, I'm not going to start him over names like Rashee Rice and Malik Neighbors and Mike Evans and, you know, the DK Metcalfs of the world. And, you know, it's just that's where I am. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully people understand where I'm coming from there. But impressive performance last week. Let's see if he can repeat it again in week number 4. All right. The 12th matchup we will look at is the Chiefs at the Chargers. 39.5 point over under. The Chiefs are heavily favored. They're 8.5 point favorites on the road. And let's be honest, no disrespect to Chargers fans. You guys don't really have home games, do you? Okay. Figure it out. What's up with your fan base? All right. Why is every game a road game? Okay. Potentially no Justin Herbert. The matchup already versus the Chiefs makes me not want to start a wide receiver here. So I would label these guys must sits. But the fact that Justin Herbert is dealing with an injury as well, that just solidifies it. I don't think you can play one of these names. Now, as far as Rashee Rice, my guy in 2024, you guys know this, have him everywhere. It's been so fun to watch. teams are still double, triple teaming Travis Kelce, and they're leaving Rashee Rice open, and he's going absolutely nuts. Of course, you're going to start the guy who is a top 2 wide receiver in fantasy football right now through 3 weeks, Xavier Worthy. The question is, do you like to party? We keep telling you guys, look, not every party is beneficial for your health. Sometimes you leave a party and you go home and you wake up the next day and you're like, why did I ruin my life like this? That party was awful. Sometimes you can meet the love of your life at a party. So the question is, do you like to party? Okay, but you have to be held accountable for your actions if that party wasn't good for you. He's a party play. You decide if you want to throw him out there or not. What I will say is I don't know how much they'll need him versus the Chargers, but he's a fun start to think about. All right, the 13th matchup we'll look at is the Browns at the Raiders. 2 teams who are 1-2 again. Amari Cooper, the bounce back happened last week versus the New York Giants, and he's got such a good stretch of games coming up. The Raiders this week, the Commanders next week, the Eagles in week 6. Amari Cooper could completely revitalize his name, repair his reputation, and clearly he's the number 1 target in Cleveland. I know there were a couple comments on the video last week. Jerry Jeudy's the wide receiver 1. It's already happened. You don't know what you're talking about. Well, clearly that's not the case. Clearly, Amari Cooper is still a very talented player. He was getting open. I mean, he made someone lose their shoes on a route. He's still getting open at a high rate. He was just making silly mistakes that we don't typically used to see him making, right? So definitely a must start. My wide receiver, 14 on the week. Love the matchup for him. I don't feel comfortable starting any other Brown. Now, on the opposite side of the ball, you can totally start Devontae Adams. You could chase the game from Jacoby Myers, but I say there's 2 weeks of bad games. There was 1 week of good games for Jacoby Myers. That's not something that I personally want to chase. All right, the 14th matchup we will look at. This is Sunday Night Football. We've got Bills at Ravens. 46.5 point over under. The Ravens are favored at home. This is tied for the 3rd highest over under of the week. The Bills wide receivers, each and every week, it's so difficult to really put your pulse on what's happening. What I will say is Shakir is a clear start. If you're going to start one of these names, yes, Keon Coleman had a touchdown. It was from 1 target. How are you supposed to rely on that moving forward? Khalil Shakir has been consistent. He hasn't scored under 10 fantasy points in PPR leagues in any single game. So, in what should be a high over under, Shakir is totally in play. I don't want to start the other guys though. And as far as Baltimore goes, they are going to use Rashad Bateman, so that will lead to times where Zay Flowers is a bad start, but you got to start this guy. Remember, he was averaging 10.5 targets per game through the first 2 weeks. And if you watch the Dallas game, let's be honest, the Ravens didn't need to throw the ball pretty much at any point in that game. They were dominating from beginning to finish, even though the Cowboys almost came back. But offensively, they were dominating, and they never really needed to target a guy like Zay Flowers. I still think he's in play in what should be a very fun matchup. All right, let's go on to Monday Night Football here. We got a couple double headers to talk about. Titans at Dolphins. Tennessee has got to be one of the worst teams in the NFL. I think the Jags and the Titans are kind of fighting for who has a right to that claim, but this is a double header, tied for the lowest over-under of the week. Let's start with the Titans. Will Levis. Yes, I've been a notorious Will Levis doubter. You could call me a hater if that's what you want to call me. I don't know that I saw anything in week 3 to suggest that things are going to change for Will Levis. He's sporadic. He's up and down. It's a bit like Carson Wentz in Indianapolis. You never know what you're going to get. It's fun to watch. It's funny to watch, but you never know exactly what you're going to get. Calvin Ridley was already the definition of boom bust, in my opinion. Now you add the fact that DeAndre Hopkins is starting to play more and more snaps. DeAndre Hopkins was the wide receiver 1 for this team last week in targets, in receiving yards, in touchdowns. So now that you have Hopkins and Ridley competing for targets, and you're attached to a quarterback that is so sporadic, I don't know how you start these guys with confidence, so I would label them spot starts. I can't in good conscience be like, yeah, you got to put them into your lineups. As far as the Dolphins go, let's hope, for God's sake, Skylar Thompson is not out there again. You can't convince me that he didn't put a diaper on before that game. He was so scared the entire time. It was like he was prepared to poop his pants on every drop back. You just can't convince me he didn't have a diaper on. Hopefully, they make a change at quarterback. Tyreek Hill only had 5 targets last week. Clearly, Mike McDaniels is going to say, what can we do to make our offense better without Tua? Let's get Tyreek Hill the ball. Maybe we should do that. So I'm going to label Tyreek Hill a must start. Jalen Waddle is not someone that I'm comfortable starting. I just think that they're going to figure out Tyreek in a more prominent role. Now, the last game we'll look at is another Monday Night Football game, Seahawks at Lions. I am so excited for this game. The 3-0 Seattle Seahawks, 47.5 point over-under, second highest over-under of the week. The amount of fantasy points we just saw from Commanders and Bengals on Monday night, I think we could see a similar game for the Lions and the Seahawks. I am so excited about this matchup for fantasy football. Let's talk about the Seahawks. The Lions give up the second most points to fantasy wide receivers. DK Metcalf is a must start. I'm definitely going to play Jackson Smith and Jigba this week. On top of this, you have to know that the Lions are number 1 in points allowed to slot wide receivers this year. So JSN should be a huge play in a game where the Seahawks are probably going to have to throw. I get it. JSN wasn't that great last week, but guys, they never had to throw the ball at any point in that game. JSN just was not needed. He still played way more snaps than Tyler Lockett. Now, for the Lions side of the ball, this is technically a tough matchup, but of course you're going to start Amon-Ra St. Brown, my wide receiver 1 on the week, and Jameson Williams does enter that spot start category because we are aware now that there is that boom bust potential. But if Laporta is out for this game, you can go ahead and bump Jameson Williams into a must start type of category, a top 25 play. We'll just have to monitor Sam Laporta's injury reports throughout the week. Okay, those are all the matchups. How did I do? Hopefully you guys enjoyed these videos. I'm working my ass off to get both of them out the same day each week for you guys. So do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe if you like the content. The last thing I'll say is if you have a start, sit, a trade question, or really anything, check out the pinned comment. There's a link to our website where you can ask me a question at any point and I will reply to you offline through the site. I appreciate you watching. Go get a win in week 4. All love. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, LAND, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.